Breaking news has captured national attention because a claim is circulating that $2,000 checks could be issued to Americans without congressional approval. If true, this would dramatically change the way federal funds are managed in the United States. This is not a rumor, social media speculation, or a statement taken out of context. It is a direct assertion with enormous implications, especially for people watching closely for any form of financial relief. The concept of money going straight to households without lawmakers' consent sounds almost impossible, and that is precisely why it matters. If a president could truly bypass Congress in distributing funds, it would overturn the rules most Americans assume govern spending and federal authority. Before anyone gets excited or dismissive, it is essential to address one crucial question. Is this claim legally valid, or is it merely rhetoric? Understanding the answer requires looking past headlines and political messaging to examine the legal and practical realities. The issue is especially pressing because discussions of $2,000 checks have resurfaced repeatedly, often at times when Americans are most concerned about rising costs, inflation, or financial security. For those living on fixed incomes, retirees, and families stretched by everyday expenses, even the possibility of such payments draws significant attention. Yet this is precisely why a careful examination is necessary. Political statements often sound decisive, but clarity and confidence do not equate to legal authority. Political figures frequently speak with certainty to inspire belief or support, but confidence in delivery is not the same as possessing actual power. Statements repeated often can create a perception of legitimacy, but repetition cannot override constitutional constraints. To separate hope from reality, it is critical to examine the mechanics of government authority, funding, and budgetary limitations. Any claim about direct payments from the federal government must be scrutinized in light of the established checks and balances designed to prevent unilateral spending. The claim in question originated from a public exchange during a formal interview, where the question itself highlighted a major legal barrier. The inquiry referred to prior statements from senior economic advisors emphasizing that Congress must authorize any new payments. The question did not ask whether the checks should happen. It asked who has the power to make them happen. That distinction between proposal and authority is vital because it separates discussion from actionable power. In response, the claim suggested that such payments could proceed without congressional approval. That answer sparked widespread discussion and confusion. The statement gained attention due to the certainty with which it was delivered. It suggested that the revenue generated from tariffs could be sufficient to fund at least a $2,000 payment per eligible household, potentially with income limitations. There was even discussion of using that same revenue to reduce the national debt. However, the critical line was the suggestion that Congress might not be necessary. It was framed as a statement of ability, not intention, which naturally led many to assume a legal mechanism existed to support it. Yet it is crucial to separate delivery from legality. While tariffs generate government revenue, that revenue does not belong to the president for discretionary distribution. All funds collected, through taxes, tariffs, or other means, flow into the Treasury, but spending decisions rest with Congress. This is not a technicality. It is a cornerstone of the American system of government. The legislative branch alone holds the power of appropriation, ensuring that no single individual can unilaterally direct massive sums of public money. Without this safeguard, the separation of powers would collapse. This is why assertions of bypassing Congress directly clash with one of the strongest constitutional protections. Even when the executive branch collects significant revenue, it cannot redistribute funds without explicit authorization. Any suggestion otherwise ignores these fundamental guardrails. Economic advisors have repeatedly confirmed this reality. Congressional approval is mandatory for new payments. While confidence in rhetoric may capture public attention, procedural reality cannot be ignored. Payments cannot be issued independently of the legislative process, and the notion of a dedicated pot of tariff money waiting to be sent directly to households is misleading. Even if Congress were hypothetically on board, another challenge emerges: the numbers themselves. Analysts have projected annual tariff revenue at approximately $300 to $350 billion. On the surface, this seems substantial, but distributing $2,000 per household would cost far more. Estimates place the required funding between $400 and $600 billion, depending on eligibility criteria. The shortfall is significant. Even the highest projections of tariff revenue are insufficient to cover payments alone, meaning additional sources or borrowing would be necessary. This is a mathematical reality, not a political argument. If the government were to move forward despite a revenue shortfall, it would require borrowing. The federal government continues to operate with an overall deficit, despite occasional monthly surpluses. Any effort to fund widespread payments without adequate revenue would increase the national debt. Borrowing itself is not inherently problematic, but it has consequences. Large deficit-funded payments introduce additional money into the economy without a corresponding increase in goods and services, which can contribute to inflation. Inflation affects everyone but is particularly burdensome for those on fixed incomes. A $2,000 check might feel helpful initially, but as prices rise for groceries, utilities, and essential items, the real value of that money diminishes. Unlike stimulus checks, inflationary pressures are ongoing and cumulative. This is why economists caution against deficit-funded payments, especially when inflation is already a concern. While the short-term benefit may feel immediate, the long-term impact can quietly undermine financial stability. Understanding the funding mechanism is just as important as understanding the legal authority to issue payments. There is no existing provision that allows a president to unilaterally distribute federal revenue. Emergency powers are limited and have historically never overridden the requirement for congressional appropriation in matters of broad spending. Courts have consistently reinforced that appropriations are the prerogative of the legislative branch. Any attempt to bypass this framework would almost certainly face immediate legal challenges and would be halted before any money reached citizens. Despite these barriers, the concept of direct payments continues to resurface because it resonates emotionally. Direct payments are simple, relatable, and immediately understandable, especially in times of economic uncertainty. The idea cuts through complex policy discussions and feels tangible in a way that legislative debate often does not. This explains why claims about $2,000 checks persist, even when the underlying legal and financial obstacles remain unchanged. Repetition and familiarity create attention and anticipation, but they do not substitute for funding or lawful authority. For the public, the most important takeaway is managing expectations. Currently, there is no approved legislation, no designated funding, and no clear mechanism that would allow for direct payments of $2,000 without congressional approval. Any realistic progress would require a formal proposal, legislative debate, and passage of an appropriation bill. Until those steps occur, claims of imminent payments should be viewed as aspirational, not guaranteed. Planning and decision-making should rely on confirmed developments rather than theoretical possibilities. At the same time, it is understandable why these claims gain traction. Rising costs, inflation, and economic uncertainty make the prospect of immediate relief deeply appealing. Yet clarity is more valuable than hope when it comes to personal finances. Understanding the limits of executive authority, the essential role of Congress, and the consequences of deficit spending equips people to make informed decisions rather than reacting to headlines. Knowledge about the process, bills, votes, and funding language is far more predictive of outcomes than statements made with confidence or repeated in media coverage. Recognizing the distinction between messaging and legal reality also explains why discussions of payments continue to recur. The promise of a check is easy to communicate, emotionally compelling, and universally understandable. It draws attention in ways that technical economic explanations rarely do. However, familiarity should not be confused with feasibility. Legal constraints, funding gaps, and economic consequences remain unchanged by rhetoric or repetition. Claims that bypass Congress or rely solely on tariff revenue are misleading. Ultimately, understanding this issue boils down to three facts. First, Congress controls federal spending, and no president can unilaterally authorize nationwide payments. Second, tariff revenue alone is insufficient to fund payments of $2,000 per household. Third, any attempt to cover a shortfall through borrowing carries economic consequences, particularly in the form of inflation. These realities provide a framework for assessing future claims. They allow the public to distinguish between hopeful statements and actionable possibilities, between political messaging and the actual mechanisms of government. In practical terms, that means anyone anticipating direct payments should focus on legislative developments rather than statements or predictions. Congress, appropriations committees, and the passage of funding bills determine whether and how relief measures will reach households. Media coverage, sound bites, or confident assertions, while attention-grabbing, do not alter this reality. Planning financial decisions based on confirmed legislation protects against disappointment or misallocation of resources. At the same time, it is natural for people to pay attention to these conversations. The stress of rising costs, uncertainty about economic conditions, and the desire for relief make such topics resonate. Yet, understanding the limits of what can actually occur is empowering. It equips people to interpret headlines critically, make informed decisions, and separate emotional reactions from policy reality. Knowing the system and the constraints on power provides clarity that optimism alone cannot. In conclusion, claims that $2,000 checks could be issued without congressional approval combine appealing simplicity with serious practical and legal obstacles. The legislative branch holds spending authority, the available revenue is insufficient, and deficit funding introduces economic risks. While repeated messaging keeps the idea in public attention, the procedural and fiscal realities remain unchanged. Recognizing these facts allows for a grounded perspective, enabling individuals to understand what is possible, what is likely, and what remains aspirational. By focusing on confirmed actions and legislative processes, citizens can plan responsibly and avoid being misled by headlines that emphasize possibility over reality.